walking on water, restoring withered limbs in an instant, zapping trees and killing them right away, walking through closed doors. Christianity sure makes some wild assertions about Jesus of Nazareth, who he was, what he could do. Let's explore 8 blatant flaws in claims made by gospel writers. The Essence of Reality explores how the psyche which you are creates the reality you encounter. Haha, you found the essence of reality. We explore consciousness here, the nature of your own existence, as in how life actually works. Common paradigms like religion and science simply don't describe experienced reality. Worse, if you believe in them, they actually hide life's real flow. You create your life's qualities. No God does, no external power source does, you do. If you want to see how, listen with an open mind and come back again. We sure have a lot to cover. This issue looks at religion with a focus on Christianity, namely, what's wrong with it. So much is askew with this old-time religion, in fact, that 6 parts are needed just to regard all the points. Part 3 here explores rational problems, real question marks of believability to the stories reported by gospel writers. Part 2 raised compositional issues, that the writers are unknown and anything but objective, writing long after Jesus' death, based only on exaggerated oral traditions, and so forth. Here, though, we regard gospel content on rational grounds, things reported as actual events that are well outside the scope of possibility. The Gospels are the only information on Jesus of Nazareth, with no historic reference to him until 60 years after he died. Everything known about that man stems from the Gospels. So, the believability of Christianity about Jesus' nature totally rides gospel accounts. If on examination the gospel accounts prove untrustworthy, then the whole religion crumbles into a heap of deceptive ideas. Conjecture without substance. Tom Nehrer here, Exploring Consciousness. Insights here add to my website, my books, and hundreds of talks I've given to open-minded groups. From a mystic experience years ago through my long inner journey, I've come to see the oneness of things. You're connected to life events and relationships, not separate and apart like science and religion imply. Aware of that connection, you can improve real life in all ways by finding and changing inner roots to outer problems. I call this clear awareness, bypassing beliefs to see clearly how life works. Some of the beliefs most in need of bypass are those that formulate Orthodox Christianity. In researching the roots of Christianity for my 3rd book, The Illusion of Truth, I read a great deal about the historical Jesus, that is, conclusions biblical scholars reach about his nature by exploring ancient manuscripts and historical context. Fascinating reading. Much of my questioning of gospel veracity rides their research. I am certainly not a biblical scholar, nor, of course, what I want to be. A clear understanding of Jesus of Nazareth can only be gleaned by one who breaks out of the confines of common thinking, just as Jesus did in his day. I've done that. My unique perspectives are contained in extensive original writing about consciousness and life, and of course these many videos. Biblical scholars, on the other hand, are deeply mired in old religious thinking. Their conclusions as to Jesus' nature can only ride logical deduction, which rests on their own highly slanted belief systems. Certainly, biblical scholars have done great research on crusty shreds of ancient documents, analyzing their real nature, but scholars' conclusions are biased by their beliefs. For my part, I can refer to collective academic research, but draw my own conclusions. My viewpoint is much more sensitive to the visionary nature of Jesus than traditional devotional or scholarly conclusions could ever be. So let's contemplate the Gospels and their authors, whoever they were. Consider this. Imagine you were an author aiming to write a biography on someone. You would need to gather together all the information you could find. Facts, reliable reports, books, perhaps magazine articles. Maybe interview the subject or others who knew or worked with that person. But authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, reporting about Jesus' life and deeds late in the first century, had no such material to draw from. There were no libraries then outside of Alexandria, no magazines or newspapers, and no one left to interview. 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death, 2 generations had passed. Jesus' contemporaries, illiterate peasants, had long since died, leaving no written records. The only information available to those gospel writers came through oral traditions. But stories passed along for 4 decades weren't reliable accounts of what actually happened during Jesus' travels. Rather, they were larger-than-life stories circulated among superstitious peasants, growing in myth at each retelling. Even after the Gospel of Mark was rendered to writing in crude Greek dialect about 70 AD, lore about Jesus continued to be exaggerated. 15 or so years after that, 2 other writers, independently but both drawing from Mark, expanded on Jesus' lore. Authors of works later called Matthew and Luke, living possibly in Syria, Asia Minor, or Egypt, nobody really knows, added more myth to the picture. Mark's wandering teacher became a miracle-working holy man, born of a virgin impregnated by the deity himself. Stories common to ancient myth. By the end of the first century, when John was written, Jesus' legend approached deity status. No longer just Son of God, he became God incarnate, eternally existent. The ever-escalating myth is easy to track when you see the real order of gospel composition. In my book, The Illusion of Truth, I itemize 8 rational problems to gospel credibility. For details, pick up a copy of my in-depth look at Jesus. It details the gospel's many issues, reconstructs his life, and explains in depth what he meant in his parables. For now, though, let's look at 8 real issues concerning gospel credibility, all based on rational grounds, on what is really possible, not silly myth of miracles that never can happen in reality. Least among gospel flaws are historical and geographical inaccuracies. For example, Mark reports in chapter 7, verse 31, that Jesus went from, quote, the vicinity of Tyre down through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, unquote. The author seemed unaware that Sidon was actually north of Tyre, both being on the coast, that is, neither up nor down in ancient terminology, while the Sea of Galilee lies to the southeast. You just couldn't go that way. There was no ancient road from Sidon through the hills towards eastern Galilee. What's reported there simply isn't accurate. Other geographical inaccuracies exist as well, but those aren't nearly as problematic as the gospel's second great flaw, impossible reports, as I call them. These are things that are reported as actual facts that the gospel writers could not possibly have known. Gospels often directly quote conversations or events that decades later nobody could know. Here's what I mean. Matthew chapter 9 reports where a paralytic man went after being healed. How would you know 50 years later where the guy went after he left the scene? John chapter 18 reveals in detail exactly what Pilate, Jesus, and others said during his trial. Verbatim now, direct quotes, even though that trial would have taken place in secret 70 years prior. Impossible. Luke seems to know word for word what angels said to Mary and Zechariah in private prior to Jesus' birth a century before. Matthew even knows what angels said to Joseph in his dreams. Who could have known those things, recorded the info, and passed it along for 100 years? Not possible. Luke in chapter 1 even knows on which side of the altar that the angel appeared to Zechariah, even though Zech was struck dumb by the angel and couldn't have said a word to anybody for a year after that. Funny, I remember at age 6 or so asking my devout mother why angels didn't show up anymore. I hadn't seen any. Her answer was something like, oh, God didn't work that way anymore. The real answer was, angels don't exist now. Didn't when I was 6, and didn't 2,000 years ago. Stories about them are fantasies. Anyway, the Gospel of John, at the beginning, explains what was going on with the Logos. That's the original Greek word for the Word in English. What was going on with the Logos and God, not just from a century earlier, but from the beginning of time. How could he have had that information? How could anybody know that? Divine inspiration? No, he made it up. You know the story in John about Roman soldiers hoisting up a vinegar-soaked sponge to Jesus on the cross? Somehow John's writers even knew, chapter 29, at least 70 years later, the type of plant whose stalk was used to hoist up the sponge. Now that is absurdly impossible. These are all examples, and there are dozens more, of those anonymous gospel writers reporting events as factual that would have been impossible for them to know. Such stories as these, expressed from an omniscient standpoint, where the author knows all details of all events, show clearly that the gospel works are fiction. Stories were clearly made up to suit the need of the authors to express their idea that Jesus was somehow deified. Indeed, the Gospels ignore reality regularly. That's the third rational problem, functional impossibilities. Already as a 10-year-old, I balked at Christianity when they told me Jesus walked on water or turned water to wine. These things didn't happen and couldn't have happened. They are false reports meant to puff up Jesus' status. I could see that as a kid. 2 billion people simply accept ancient stories of functional impossibilities as true. Amazing. Luke and Matthew, each in chapter 4, report that Satan, who by the way doesn't exist in reality either, that Satan led Jesus up to a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of the world. That thought was consistent with ancient notions of a flat, bounded earth, covered by a big dome called the firmament. But it's absolutely impossible on the globe-shaped earth, which first-century people, gospel writers included, weren't aware of. Are you familiar with the ascension? In Luke chapter 4, the author claims that Jesus, having come back from the dead to meet with the disciples on several occasions, Jesus was taken up before their very eyes into heaven. Well, where do you think he went? Into orbit? No. In ancient times, heaven was a real location above the firmament and above the waters they thought existed above that imagined firmament. Heaven to them was a real place where real physical Yahweh God lived. Of course, none of that exists. Not a flat earth, not a firmament, not heaven. Those are made-up stories meant to aggrandize Jesus. Elijah had been lifted into heaven in the scriptures. The Old Testament, Jesus had to do that too. That's fiction. Nothing more. Pure fiction. Such stories don't reveal mysteries and wonders of a God-imbued superhuman. They expose the primitive ignorance of reality. The fourth point of gospel fallacy is just that, ignorance of reality. Visualize feeding the multitude as reported in all the Gospels on 2 occasions. Large groups numbering in the thousands were supposedly fed with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Imagine yourself there on the scene. Picture volunteers ripping off pieces of bread to hand to people. Do you think that the bread grew back to fill the hole? Or did new loaves appear at the end of the table as quickly as loaves were served? When fish appeared, were they already cooked, spiced, and cut into servings? Or did new fried fish appear whole, suddenly, poof, as each one was handed out? Were napkins and ketchup provided miraculously? These feeding of the multitude myths did not happen in reality. Not ever. The stories were invented to make Jesus outdo Elisha of Old Testament times. Prophet Elisha was reputed in 2 Kings chapter 4 to have fed 100 people with 20 loaves. Well, that didn't happen either, by the way, but new hero Jesus had to have fed more people with less food. In my book, I go on to illustrate 4 other real problems with Gospels. Irreconcilable conflicts constitute one rational issue, where one thing is claimed in one New Testament writing, but the opposite is stated elsewhere. Many biblical accounts contradict one another. We'll explore those later. There are so many contradictions, it takes a while. A 6th issue is myth presented as fact. I already mentioned walking on water and such. Gospel accounts make many falsehoods into stories it claims actually happened. With so many of these, that category deserves a video of its own as well. How about the 7th point, retroactive prognostication? Here, Gospel writers claim Jesus foretold particular events, but the stories were written after those events took place. That's a common ruse in the Bible, pretending things were mystically foretold, when actually the report stems from a time when those supposed prognostications had already happened. That one, and the 8th rational problem with the Gospels, we'll explore in detail later. The 8th is interesting too, messianic prophecies in the Gospels that are bogus. The Gospels reveal their real nature when explored in depth. That is, not simply taken as unquestioned truth. They are not visionary works delving into divine truths revealed by connected people at the behest of an all-powerful God. They are primitive works of fiction meant to convince highly gullible, ignorant people of mythical wonders which don't exist in reality. The New Testament Gospels are the only source of information on Jesus of Nazareth. The only source. All the claims made by Christianity about him ride the trustworthiness of those archaic works. With some details yet to cover, I've shown here enough already to clearly reveal that the Gospels are works of fiction. They have no substance to them, no veracity to their miraculous claims, and very little value beyond preserving Jesus' parables, which do have value. Life has meaning. Your life incorporates multifaceted meaning and value, that's for sure, but none of the brilliance of the life experience is revealed in Christianity's base documents. Only archaic stories of myth, miracle, and ultimately fantasy. Check out part 4 of these 6 on what's wrong with Christianity. In the face of millennia of Christian fallacy and hype, these things are very important to understand. See you there. If, on examination, the gospel accounts prove untrustworthy, then the whole religion crumbles into a heap of deceptive ideas, conjecture without substance. A clear understanding of Jesus of Nazareth can only be gleaned by one who breaks out of the confines of common thinking, just as Jesus did in his day. I've done that. Biblical scholars, on the other hand, are deeply mired in old religious thinking. Their conclusions as to Jesus' nature are biased by their beliefs. Aiming to write a biography on someone, you would need to gather together all the information you could find. Facts, reliable reports, books, perhaps magazine articles. But authors of the Gospel had no such material to draw from. The Gospel's second great flaw, impossible reports, as I call them. These are things Gospel writers report as real events that they could not possibly have known. I remember at the age of 6 or so asking my devout mother why angels didn't show up anymore. I hadn't seen any. The real answer was, angels don't exist now, and didn't when I was 6, and didn't 2,000 years ago. Such stories as these, expressed from an omniscient standpoint, where the author knows all details of all events, show clearly that the gospel works are fiction. Jesus walked on water or turned water to wine. These things didn't happen and couldn't have happened. They are functional impossibilities. The ascension, feeding the multitude. Such stories don't reveal mysteries and wonders of a God-imbued superhuman. They expose a primitive ignorance of reality. Retroactive prognostication. Here, gospel writers claim Jesus foretold particular events, but the stories were written after those events took place. That's a common ruse in the Bible, pretending things were mystically foretold, when actually the report stems from a time when those supposed prognostications had already happened.